That package is mine now, Mr. Calloway. Consider it a processing fee for the trouble you've caused this neighborhood.
She said it, standing in my driveway, my stolen box tucked under one arm, car keys already swinging from the other, like she'd rehearsed it on the drive over. Carol Simmons, HOA treasurer, self-appointed sheriff of Maplewood Commons, holding something she'd stolen off my porch steps, and smiling. I didn't move, didn't raise my voice, just looked at her the way you look at someone who has absolutely no idea they've already lost. "Okay, Carol," I said. 2 words, because Detective Reyes from Austin PD was parked 2 houses down, because Frank, my retired neighbor, was already filming from his porch, because the box under her arm contained a UV dye canister rigged to detonate the moment she opened the flap. She thought she was ending the conversation. She was finishing her own confession, out loud, in front of a witness, with the evidence literally in her hands. I could have stopped this 8 months ago. I didn't, because Carol still had more rope to collect, and people like her always take it. How confident does someone have to be before they stop noticing the walls closing in? I'm Ryan Calloway, 41 years old, network security engineer, relocated to Austin 8 months ago when my company transferred me to their Central Texas operations hub. I'm not the kind of person who makes enemies easily. I'm not the kind of person who makes much noise at all, if I'm being honest. I show up early, document everything, and solve problems the way I was trained to, methodically, with redundancy built in at every layer. Maplewood Commons looked good on paper. Quiet streets, reasonable HOA fees, decent school ratings even though I don't have kids. The listing mentioned a strong sense of community. What it didn't mention was that the community had a treasurer who'd been running unopposed for 4 years because nobody wanted to sit across from her long enough to fill out a nomination form. My house is the 3rd from the corner on Delwood, a gray Craftsman with a wide porch and a 2-car garage I mostly use for storage. I set up my first camera the week I moved in, not because I was paranoid, but because I'm a network security engineer and securing a perimeter is just what I do. 2 cameras, wide angle, cloud-backed, standard setup. By month 2, I had 4 cameras. I work from home 3 days a week. The other 2, I'm in the office by 7 and back before 6. My days have a rhythm. Coffee at 6, systems check by 6:15, first meeting at 8. I cook most nights. I keep a running log of household expenses, maintenance schedules, delivery tracking numbers. My neighbors probably think I'm boring. I don't mind that. Frank lives directly across the street. Retired postal worker, mid-70s, moves slow but misses nothing. He started waving at me about 2 weeks after I moved in. By month 3, we had a standing routine. He'd be on his porch with coffee most mornings, and we'd exchange maybe 6 words each. That was enough. Frank wasn't the kind of man who talked much either. He was the kind of man who watched. My first missing package was a router, high-end, shipped in a box that made its contents obvious. I assumed porch pirates. It's Austin. It happens. Filed a claim, reordered, moved on. The second was a blood pressure monitor for my father, overnighted. The third was a laptop sleeve that had my company's name printed on the shipping label. 3 packages in 5 weeks, different days, different carriers, but the same narrow window, always between noon and 3 on weekdays when most people on the block were at work. That was when I stopped assuming and started paying attention. I've worked in network security long enough to understand one thing about bad actors. They don't stop because you ask them to. They stop because the cost of continuing finally outweighs the reward. Until that calculation flips, every warning you issue just tells them how much they can still get away with. That principle doesn't stay at the office. I carry it everywhere. My father used to say that the most dangerous response to being wronged is the fastest one. Not because speed is always wrong. Sometimes you need to move immediately. But because when you react before you understand, you hand the other person the script. You become the problem. You become the noise. And the person who actually caused the damage gets to stand back, look reasonable, and watch you discredit yourself. I've seen it happen in corporate environments more times than I can count. Someone catches a colleague manipulating data, confronts them loudly in front of the team, and by the end of the week, the whistleblower is the one being investigated for creating a hostile work environment. The manipulator walks, not because they were smarter, but because they were calmer in the moment that mattered. I made a decision early in my career. I don't move until I have something that doesn't require my word against theirs. Not out of cowardice, out of precision. There's a difference between letting something go and choosing your moment. One is surrender, the other is strategy. When the third package disappeared, I felt the familiar pull to go knock on doors, to make calls, to let someone know I wasn't going to tolerate it. I've learned to sit with that feeling long enough to ask a better question. Not what do I want to do right now, but what do I want the outcome to be 6 months from now? 6 months from now, I wanted whoever was doing this to have no viable defense, no reasonable doubt, no alternate explanation that a reasonable person might accept. I wanted a pattern so thoroughly documented that denying it would require denying arithmetic. That takes time, it takes discipline, and it takes being willing to absorb a few more hits in the short term so the long-term outcome is airtight. People who abuse small amounts of power share one consistent flaw. They believe their position protects them from accountability. They've never been seriously checked, so they genuinely can't imagine it happening. That blind spot is an asset, if you're patient enough to let it do its work. Carol Simmons had been HOA treasurer for 4 years without a single real challenge. That kind of uninterrupted confidence doesn't make you careful. It makes you sloppy. Have you ever watched someone grow more certain of themselves with every step they took in the wrong direction? Let me be specific about what was actually being stolen, because missing packages sounds like a minor inconvenience, the kind of thing you shrug at, file an insurance claim for, and forget by the following week. That's not what this was. The blood pressure monitor was for my father, who lives alone in San Marcos and had just been prescribed a home monitoring regimen after a cardiac event in March. I overnighted it because his doctor wanted readings logged within the week. When it disappeared, I had to reorder and wait 4 days while my father used a broken cuff that gave inconsistent readings. 4 days isn't a long time, unless you're 73 and your cardiologist is waiting on data. The router controlled the home network I used for remote work, including access to client systems I'm contractually obligated to keep secure. Its disappearance meant a gap in my security architecture that I had to patch manually while a replacement shipped. My company noticed. I had to explain it to my supervisor. 2 of the missing packages contained prescription medications. One, a refill of a maintenance drug. One, a specialty compound that couldn't simply be picked up at a pharmacy. Both required reordering through insurance. Both triggered automatic fraud flags that took time to clear. And one required a phone call to my doctor to reissue the prescription entirely. 11 households on Delwood and the surrounding 2 blocks had experienced the same pattern. I know because I asked. Quietly, one conversation at a time over 6 weeks. Most of them had assumed bad luck or random theft. One woman, a nurse who worked night shifts, had lost a package containing a controlled substance and spent 2 weeks worried she'd be flagged by her employer for a missing medication report. This wasn't a petty nuisance. This was someone systematically reaching into people's lives and taking things that mattered: medical equipment, prescriptions, work tools, and doing it with the calm of a person who had calculated, correctly, that none of her neighbors would ever be able to prove anything. The stolen goods were replaceable, mostly. What Carol was really stealing was the assumption of safety, the feeling that your own front steps belong to you. That's not something you file a claim for. That's something you get back a different way. Frank told me on a Tuesday morning, same as always, him on his porch with a mug, me checking the mail before my 8 o'clock call. "That Simmons woman took something off your steps yesterday," he said. Matter of fact as reading weather. No dramatization, no hedge. Just a man who'd spent 30 years as a postal worker stating an observed fact. I've watched her do it to 3 other houses on this block. I didn't react the way he probably expected. Didn't swear, didn't pull out my phone, didn't ask him to repeat himself. I just nodded slowly and said, "Which direction did she go when she left?" Frank pointed south, toward the cul-de-sac where Carol Simmons lived. I went back inside and pulled up my camera footage from the previous afternoon. The angle on my primary camera covered the porch steps and the front walkway clearly, but the driveway approach came in from the left edge of frame, just far enough that a face was never fully captured. I'd noticed the blind spot before and made a note to adjust the mount. I hadn't gotten around to it. What I could see clearly, a silver Lexus ES partial plate pulling to the curb at 2:17 p.m. A figure in a light-colored blazer moving up the walkway with no hesitation, manicured hand lifting the package, the same unhurried return to the car, door closing, vehicle departing south, 41 seconds start to finish. I sat with that footage for a long time, not because I needed to watch it again. I'd absorbed everything useful in the first two viewings. I sat with it because I was making a decision about what kind of problem this actually was. A neighbor stealing packages was one kind of problem. Irritating, petty, solvable with a confrontation or a police report. But a neighbor who had been doing this for months, selectively, during predictable windows, targeting higher value deliveries, operating with that level of comfort, that was a different kind of problem entirely. That was someone who had run this calculation many times and concluded the risk was negligible. Someone who believed, based on extended experience, that nobody on this block was going to do anything about it. That belief was the most important data point I had, because it meant Carol wasn't being careful. She wasn't varying her timing, using different vehicles, avoiding patterns. She was operating on autopilot, sustained entirely by the assumption of impunity. And people operating on autopilot leave the same tracks every single time. I opened a new spreadsheet that evening. Column A, date. Column B, delivery notification timestamp. Column C, camera event timestamp. Column D, package value. Column E, carrier. Column F, notes. I titled it simply, Documentation. I didn't know yet exactly how this would end, but I knew that whatever Carol Simmons thought she was building, a record of easy scores, a neighborhood too passive to push back, she was actually building something else entirely. She just didn't know it yet. The monthly HOA meeting fell on a Wednesday, 12 days after Frank's morning observation. I'd spent those 12 days cross-referencing delivery notifications against camera timestamps, building the spreadsheet into something that could stand on its own without my interpretation. 17 entries, 9 confirmed matches to the silver Lexus, 4 instances where the camera angle was insufficient but the timing window was identical. I went to the meeting with a printed summary, 2 pages, clean formatting, no editorializing. Just dates, times, package values, and a note that 11 households on the block had reported similar losses over the same 8-month period. Carol ran the meeting the way she ran everything, efficiently, with the particular confidence of someone who controls the agenda and therefore controls the room. She sat at the head of the folding table in the community room, a yellow legal pad in front of her, dressed like she was chairing a board meeting at a downtown firm, rather than a neighborhood association gathering in a room that smelled like old carpet and someone's reheated lunch. When I raised the package theft issue under open comments, she didn't flinch. "Perhaps you should consider package lockers, Mr. Calloway," she said, not looking up from her legal pad. "This neighborhood has experienced delivery issues for years. Many residents have found them quite useful." The room was quiet. A few people looked at their hands. "I have documentation of a pattern going back 8 months," I said. 11 households. I'd like to formally request it be entered into the meeting record." She looked up then, smiled the way people smile when they're absolutely certain the other person has nothing. "I'll note your concern," she said. "Next item." I could have pushed harder, could have laid the 2 pages on the table in front of her and named what the camera footage showed. Part of me wanted to. The pull to make her uncomfortable in that room, in front of those people, was real, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I thought about what that would actually accomplish. She'd deny it. The footage was suggestive, not conclusive. A partial plate and a blazer sleeve were not enough. I'd come across as the aggressive newcomer with a grudge, and Carol, polished 4-year incumbent, home turf, would come across as the reasonable one managing a difficult resident. So I wrote down her exact words in the margin of my summary sheet. I'll note your concern. Date, time, witnesses present. Then I folded the paper, put it in my jacket pocket, and let her move to the next item. She'd been given the chance to stop. She'd chosen, very publicly, not to take it. If someone hands you a way out and you wave it off with a smile, who's really responsible for what comes next? After the meeting, things accelerated. Not on my end, on hers. It was like the act of dismissing me in that room gave Carol a kind of permission, confirmation that the neighborhood would absorb whatever she did without meaningful resistance. Within 3 weeks of the HOA meeting, Frank reported 2 more incidents on our block alone. A neighbor 2 doors down lost a smartwatch. The night shift nurse lost a package for the second time in 6 weeks. I added every entry to the spreadsheet: dates, values, timestamps, carrier confirmations. I cross-referenced each one against my camera logs and against the logs I'd started collecting from 2 neighbors who'd agreed to share their footage after quiet conversations on their driveways. Neither of them knew exactly what I was building. I just told them I was putting together documentation and asked if they'd be willing to keep copies of anything relevant. Both said yes, without hesitating. That told me something about how long this had been going on. By week 6, after the meeting, I had 11 households confirmed, total estimated losses just over $18,000, and a pattern so consistent it practically annotated itself. Same vehicle, same time window, same selective targeting, high-value items, medical shipments, anything with a brand name visible on the label. Not random, curated. I contacted Detective Reyes at Austin PD's Property Crimes Unit on a Thursday afternoon, sent him the spreadsheet, the camera clips I'd compiled, and a 1-page summary of the pattern. He called back within 2 days, longer than I'd hoped, shorter than I'd expected, and told me the documentation was the strongest he'd seen on a residential theft case at this scale. He asked if I was willing to take it further. I told him I had something in mind. The trap wasn't set yet, but the walls had been measured. The dimensions were exact. All that remained was the bait. I spent a weekend reconfiguring my camera setup. 4 cameras became 6. I repositioned the 2 existing wide angles to eliminate every blind spot on the front approach. Added a narrow focus unit aimed specifically at the curb, license plate level, auto-triggered on motion. Added another on the garage soffit, covering the driveway from the opposite angle. Every feed cloud-backed with automatic timestamp overlay. Motion event flagged, 30-day retention. Then I called 3 neighbors, Frank, the nurse 2 doors down whose name was Patricia, and a retired teacher named Dwight who lived on the corner and had been one of the quieter voices at the HOA meeting. I didn't ask them to do anything dramatic. I asked them if they'd be willing to be available on a Monday afternoon sometime in the next few weeks, close enough to their front windows to observe the street. I told them I was working with a detective from Austin PD and that their presence as witnesses might matter. Frank said, "Tell me when." Patricia said, "I've been waiting for someone to do something about this for 2 years." Dwight took a little longer, asked a few careful questions, then said yes. I emailed Detective Reyes that evening with an updated evidence package, the new camera specs, the expanded spreadsheet now covering 11 households, a compiled clip reel of every confirmed Lexus appearance over 8 months, 14 clips, clean cuts, timestamp first, no narration needed. The pattern spoke for itself. Reyes confirmed he'd reviewed everything and was prepared to move when I was ready. He didn't ask for more documentation. He had enough. What he needed was a clean capture moment, something that would hold in court without relying solely on my word or Frank's window view. That was the piece I was still constructing. Frank had mentioned, almost as an aside during one of our morning exchanges, that Carol couldn't seem to pass up anything that looked like electronics. Didn't matter whose porch it was on. Boxes with brand names, model numbers, retail-style packaging. They disappeared faster than anything else. I ordered a standard brown shipping box from a packaging supplier. Printed a label, Smart Home Hub, model SH7, $299. Loaded it with an older network switch for realistic weight. Wrapped it in bubble wrap so it moved and settled the way an actual device would. Then I ordered the dye canister. 2 days before I placed the bait package, Carol made her boldest move yet. A neighbor named Gail, 4 houses west of mine, had ordered a wheelchair-accessible ramp kit for her mother who was coming to stay for the summer. Large box, clearly labeled, delivered on a Thursday morning, gone by noon. Gail filed a report with Austin PD that afternoon, the 3rd report from Maplewood Commons residents that month alone. But that wasn't the bold move. The bold move was what Carol did at the following week's impromptu neighborhood email thread. When Gail mentioned the theft publicly and asked if anyone else had experienced similar losses recently, Carol replied within the hour. She wrote that the neighborhood had long-standing delivery infrastructure challenges and suggested that residents shipping large or valuable items should arrange for signature-required delivery or use the neighborhood's suggested package locker vendor, a service she helpfully linked, which turned out to be a company whose website listed a Carol A. Simmons as a registered affiliate partner. I screenshot the email, noted the timestamp, forwarded it to Detective Reyes with a single line of context. He replied, "Noted, that's useful." What Carol had done, in the span of one reply-all email, was establish a financial interest in the problem she was creating, document her awareness of the theft pattern, and position herself as a community resource. All simultaneously, all in writing, all timestamped and preserved in 11 neighbors' inboxes. She thought she was managing the narrative. She was footnoting her own indictment. I added the screenshot to the evidence folder, retitled the subfolder Carol, Self-Generated Documentation. By this point, I'd stopped feeling angry about the stolen packages. Anger is a reaction to surprise, and I wasn't surprised anymore. What I felt instead was something closer to professional focus. The same state I get into when I'm tracking an intrusion in a network and I can see exactly where the bad actor is heading 3 moves before they get there. The package was almost ready. So was everything else. The email thread didn't die after Carol's reply. It grew. 3 more neighbors chimed in with their own missing package stories. Someone mentioned they'd seen a silver Lexus on the block multiple times during afternoon hours. Someone else asked, carefully, whether anyone had considered raising the issue formally with the HOA board. Carol replied to that one personally. She wrote that the HOA had already been made aware of certain residents' concerns, and that the board had determined the issue was consistent with citywide delivery trends rather than any neighborhood-specific cause. She added, in the final line, that she hoped residents would refrain from speculation that could create unnecessary alarm or unfairly implicate innocent parties. That last sentence was aimed at me. Everyone on the thread knew it. I knew she knew I knew it. I forwarded the email to Detective Reyes, added it to the folder. But the moment that mattered most came 4 days later at the corner of Delwood and Marsh, where I happened to be unloading groceries from my car when Carol pulled up in the Lexus. She lowered her window. I don't think she'd planned to stop. I think she saw me and made a decision in the moment, the way people do when they've grown too comfortable with their own authority. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I want to be direct with you. I understand you've been asking questions around the neighborhood. I'd strongly encourage you to be careful about making accusations you can't support. This community has standards, and residents who create conflict tend to find the HOA process can work in a number of directions." She said it pleasantly, the way you say something threatening when you want deniability. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "I appreciate you telling me that, Carol. I'll keep it in mind." She nodded once, satisfied, and drove away. I walked back inside, sat down at my desk, and wrote out the exchange verbatim. Her words, my words, time, location, no embellishment. Saved it as a dated text file. Attached it to an email to Detective Reyes with a subject line that read, "Potential witness intimidation. Verbal, unsolicited, 4:22 p.m. today." He called me within the hour. "She said that to you directly?" he asked. "Word for word," I said. A pause. Then, "Okay, let's move your timeline up." Detective Reyes came to my house on a Friday evening, parked 2 streets over, and walked. He was younger than I'd expected, early 30s, quiet manner. The kind of person who listens more than he speaks and takes notes in a small spiral pad rather than his phone. He sat at my kitchen table and went through the full evidence package, methodically, page by page, clip by clip. without saying much until he reached the end. Then he looked up and said, "You built this like a court filing." "That was the intention," I said. He spent a long moment reviewing the affiliate partner's screenshot, Carol's email linking her own financial interest to the package locker vendor she'd been recommending to theft victims in the neighborhood. He tapped the page twice with his pen. "Mail theft is federal jurisdiction the moment USPS carriers are involved," he said, "which they are in at least 7 of your documented cases. That changes the ceiling considerably." He explained what that meant in practical terms. Federal mail theft charges carry significantly steeper penalties than state-level property theft. 2 of my documented cases involved prescription medications shipped through a USPS-contracted pharmaceutical carrier, which added potential charges related to theft of controlled substances. And Carol's email to the neighborhood thread, combined with her direct approach to me at the corner of Delwood and Marsh, had introduced a witness intimidation thread that Reyes said his supervisor had flagged as worth pursuing independently. What had started as a porch theft case was now touching 3 separate categories of criminal exposure, none of which Carol knew. Because Carol had been operating for 4 years in a neighborhood that had never once pushed back hard enough to involve law enforcement in any serious way. She had no frame of reference for what a documented, coordinated, multi-household case with federal dimensions actually looked like. She'd calibrated her risk assessment against Frank's window and my first camera setup. She hadn't recalibrated since. Reyes confirmed he would coordinate with the Postal Inspection Service on the USPS-linked cases. He had a contact at the Travis County DA's office he wanted to loop in informally before we moved. He asked me to hold the bait package deployment until he gave me a green light. He wanted everything properly positioned before the trigger was pulled. I asked him how long. 10 days, he said, maybe 12. I told him that was fine. I'd waited 8 months. 12 days was nothing. Before he left, he paused at my front door and looked at the camera mounted on the porch soffit, the new narrow focus unit aimed at curb level. "She has no idea this is here," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "She's never looked up," I said. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when a thing that seemed complicated suddenly makes complete sense. 10 days, he said again, and walked back toward his car, 2 streets over, hands in his jacket pockets, unhurried, the same way Carol walked. Except he had every reason to be. During those 10 days, I had a conversation I hadn't expected. Sandra Okafor lived 4 houses down from Carol, had been a Maplewood Commons resident for 11 years, and served as the HOA's unofficial secretary. Not a formal position, just someone who took notes at meetings and distributed minutes afterward because nobody else volunteered. She knocked on my door on a Saturday morning holding a casserole dish and an expression that said the casserole was a pretext. I invited her in. She sat at the same kitchen table where Reyes had reviewed my evidence package 6 days earlier. She told me she'd known about Carol for at least 2 years. Not suspected. Known. She'd seen the Lexus herself, twice, from her car, had recognized the blazer, the walk, the unhurried return, had gone home both times and stood in her kitchen trying to decide what to do with what she'd seen. She hadn't done anything. "I have kids in this school district," she said. "Carol sits on the HOA architectural committee. She has opinions about fence heights and holiday decorations and what color you're allowed to paint your shutters. I didn't want to be the person who accused her and couldn't prove it and then had to live next to the consequences of that for the next decade." She wasn't making excuses. She was describing a calculation that made complete sense given everything she knew about Carol Simmons and everything she didn't know about what I was building. I told her I understood. I meant it. Then I asked her, carefully, if she'd be willing to write down what she'd observed, dates as best she could remember, what she'd seen, where she'd been standing. Not for confrontation, for documentation. She was quiet for a long moment, looked down at the casserole dish she was still holding. "If I do this," she said, "it has to actually go somewhere. I'm not doing this for it to disappear into another HOA meeting." "It won't disappear," I said. She nodded, left the casserole. Came back the next morning with 2 handwritten pages, dates included, signed at the bottom. I added them to the folder. Sandra's account covered incidents I hadn't been able to confirm through camera footage alone. It filled gaps I didn't know I had. Carol had been operating in plain sight for years. The neighborhood had seen her. They just needed someone willing to do something with what they saw. How many people are sitting on the truth right now, just waiting for someone else to go first? Reyes called on day 9 with news that tightened everything. The Postal Inspection Service had fast-tracked their review of the USPS-linked cases in my documentation. 3 of the 11 households had shipped through USPS-contracted carriers, enough for federal jurisdiction to attach cleanly. The inspector assigned to the case, a woman named Tran, had cross-referenced my spreadsheet against USPS delivery confirmation logs and found 4 additional incidents I hadn't captured, pushing the total stolen goods estimate past $22,000. More importantly, Inspector Tran had identified a pattern in the targeting. Specific package weight ranges, specific label formats, specific carrier windows that was too precise to be opportunistic. Someone had learned the delivery schedules. Someone had been paying attention to which carriers ran which routes on which days. This wasn't casual theft. This was practiced, informed, and deliberate. But the timeline had a new pressure point. Carol had submitted paperwork to the HOA board 3 days earlier, proposing a formal amendment to the neighborhood's package handling policy, essentially requiring all residents to use a designated package locker service for deliveries above a certain value threshold. The locker service she'd linked in her neighborhood email weeks ago, the one where she held an affiliate partnership. The board meeting to vote on the amendment was scheduled for the following Wednesday, 11 days away. If the amendment passed, Carol would have successfully converted her theft operation into a revenue stream, residents paying a monthly fee to a service that lined her pockets, ostensibly to protect against a theft problem she herself was creating. It was brazen in a way that almost demanded admiration if you could detach from the damage it was causing. I called Reyes the moment I received the board meeting notice. "She's trying to institutionalize it," I said. "I see that," he said. "We need to move before Wednesday." The green light came the following morning. Monday, deployment. Reyes would be positioned by 1 o'clock. Frank and Patricia confirmed available. Dwight said he'd be at his front window. Sandra, who I'd updated carefully without revealing every detail, said she'd be home. I assembled the package that Sunday night at my kitchen table. Network switch centered for weight, bubble wrap layered precisely, dye canister positioned against the inner flap, pressure plate flush with the cardboard edge. I'd tested the mechanism twice on a workbench in my garage. Activation was immediate, dispersal radius roughly 18 inches, pigment bonding to fabric and skin within 4 seconds of contact. I sealed the box, applied the label. Smart Home Hub, model SSH7, $299. Set it by the front door, went to bed, slept fine. When everything you've built is finally in position, does patience feel like virtue or just like counting down? The morning of the deployment, Frank crossed the street earlier than usual. He handed me a folded piece of paper without saying anything. I opened it at my kitchen counter while the coffee was still brewing. It was a handwritten list, dates going back 14 months, each entry noting a time, a house number, and a brief description. Silver ES 240, package from number 14, white blazer. 31 entries in Frank's careful postal worker handwriting, each line level and precise. The dates never skipped, even when the gaps between incidents stretched to 2 weeks. I looked up at him. "Been keeping it since the second time I saw her," he said. "Didn't know if it would matter." I told him it mattered considerably. What Frank's log did was extend the documented timeline 14 months beyond my own records, back to well before I'd moved to Maplewood Commons. It established that this wasn't something Carol had started doing around the time of my arrival, which a defense attorney might have tried to use to muddy the waters. It showed a pattern that predated me entirely, rooted in the neighborhood long before I'd ever pointed a camera at my porch steps. It also identified 3 households I hadn't spoken with. I made calls that morning. 2 of them confirmed losses they'd never reported because they hadn't thought anything could be done. One of them, a young couple named the Nguyen's, who'd moved in 2 years ago and lost 4 packages in their first 3 months, said they'd actually considered moving because of it. They thought the neighborhood just had a theft problem. It hadn't occurred to them that the theft problem had a name and drove a silver Lexus and sent them HOA violation notices about their mailbox post. I forwarded Frank's log to Reyes at 7:15 a.m. with a cover note flagging the extended timeline and the 3 new households. He acknowledged within 20 minutes. By 8 o'clock, I had placed the package on my porch steps, label facing the street, positioned slightly off-center the way real deliveries always land. I took a photo for the record, locked the front door. Left for the office the long way, past the corner of Delwood and Marsh, past Carol's cul-de-sac, past the Lexus sitting in her driveway catching morning light off its hood. She hadn't moved it yet. I drove to the office, sat through a 9 o'clock systems review, answered emails, drank a second coffee at my desk, watched the camera feed on my phone in the gaps between meetings, the package sitting undisturbed on the steps, the street quiet, a FedEx truck passing at 11:40 without stopping. At 1:19 p.m., the motion alert fired on the curb camera, silver Lexus, pulling to the curb, unhurried. I set my phone face up on my desk and did not look away. At what point does a trap stop being something you set and become something they built for themselves, one step at a time? I need to back up 3 weeks. Because before the Monday deployment, before Frank's list, before Reyes gave me the green light, there was a Thursday that came very close to dismantling everything. Carol had filed a formal complaint with the HOA board against me. The complaint alleged that my camera installations constituted a privacy violation under the neighborhood's architectural guidelines, specifically a clause prohibiting surveillance equipment visible from the street that may create a hostile environment for residents. She'd attached photographs taken from the public sidewalk, which she was entitled to do, showing 3 of my 6 cameras. She'd highlighted the curb-level unit in yellow marker and noted in her cover letter that it appeared specifically designed to capture vehicle and pedestrian movements on the public thoroughfare in a manner inconsistent with standard residential security practice. The language was careful, deliberately careful, the kind of careful that comes from either legal consultation or a very practiced instinct for bureaucratic leverage. The board sent me a formal notice of complaint with a 14-day response window. Compliance required either removing the flagged cameras or submitting an architectural variance request, a process that typically took 6 to 8 weeks and required board approval by majority vote. A board Carol had chaired for 4 years. I read the notice twice at my kitchen table, then set it down and looked out the window at the porch steps where 8 months of missing packages had started. The timing was not a coincidence. I had spoken with Reyes 9 days earlier. I didn't know whether Carol had any awareness of that conversation, but the complaint had arrived 4 days after I'd had a quiet driveway exchange with Patricia, the night shift nurse, that I now wished had been less visible from the street. Carol noticed things. That was how she'd survived this long. If the curb-level camera came down, I lost my cleanest angle on the license plate. If the variance process dragged into the board meeting where her package locker amendment was scheduled, the entire timeline compressed in ways that made a clean capture significantly harder. For approximately 48 hours, I sat with the real possibility that she was going to outmaneuver me on procedure, not because she was right, but because she controlled the process, and she knew it. My attorney, a property rights specialist I'd consulted quietly 2 weeks into building the documentation, reviewed the complaint and told me the architectural guideline Carol had cited applied specifically to cameras mounted on shared structures or common area boundaries. My cameras were mounted entirely on my own property. The clause didn't apply. His opinion was that the complaint would fail on a straightforward reading of the guidelines, but that the process itself could be weaponized for delay. He recommended I respond in writing immediately, citing the specific guideline language and the property boundary distinction, and request an expedited review given the active law enforcement matter the cameras were supporting. I filed the response within 24 hours, copied Detective Reyes, copied Inspector Tran, sent it certified mail so the delivery timestamp was unambiguous. Carol's complaint died in committee 4 days later without a board vote. But those 4 days, watching a procedural maneuver nearly unravel 8 months of work, sitting with the possibility that patience and documentation might not be enough against someone who controlled the institutional machinery, those 4 days were the closest I came to understanding how she'd gotten away with this for so long. She was good at this. She'd had years of practice. She just hadn't met anyone willing to out-document her. What does it cost a person to stay patient when everything they've built is one procedural vote away from collapse? My father called that same Thursday evening, the night the complaint arrived. He wasn't calling about the packages. He didn't know the full extent of what I'd been building. I'd told him there'd been some neighborhood issues, kept it vague, didn't want him worrying from San Marcos about something I had under control. He called because his cardiologist had adjusted his medication protocol, and he wanted to talk through what that meant. We stayed on the phone for an hour. He sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. After we hung up, I sat for a while without turning any lights on. The blood pressure monitor that had disappeared off my porch steps, the one I'd overnighted because his doctor needed a week of readings, had cost my father 4 days of inconsistent data at a moment when consistent data mattered. 4 days isn't a dramatic number. It doesn't make a compelling headline. But my father is 73, lives alone, and had just had a cardiac event. And those 4 days existed because Carol Simmons had walked up my driveway and taken something that wasn't hers with the same casual entitlement she applied to everything else in her life. I don't say this to make the story more emotional than it is. I say it because it's the honest answer to why I didn't let this go the way most people let things go. It wasn't about the money. The $18,000 across 11 households was real damage, but it was the kind of damage that gets absorbed and forgotten over time. What didn't get absorbed, what I watched play out in conversation after conversation as I moved through the neighborhood quietly, gathering accounts, was the feeling of violation. The Winds, who'd considered moving. Patricia running through her controlled substance paperwork at 2 in the morning before a shift. Sandra standing in her kitchen for 2 years knowing what she'd seen and having nowhere to put it. Carol had taken from people who couldn't easily push back. That was the calculation. That was always the calculation. I thought about that on the Thursday the complaint arrived, sitting in the dark in my kitchen. Then I turned the lights on, opened my laptop, and drafted the certified mail response to the HOA board. Patience isn't the absence of feeling. It's what you do with the feeling instead of letting it make your decisions for you. At 1:34 p.m., Carol Simmons walked up my driveway. She didn't rush. She never rushed. That was her signature, the unhurried, proprietary stride of someone who had never once been made to feel like she was doing anything wrong. White blazer, pressed, hair set. She moved up the front walkway the way she moved through every HOA meeting, every neighborhood email thread, every procedural maneuver she'd deployed over 4 years of uncontested authority. She picked up the package with both hands, felt the weight. Satisfied, you could see it in the slight adjustment of her grip, the way she settled it against her hip. Electronics feel a particular way. This one felt right. She was halfway back to the Lexus when she opened the flap. I watched it happen on my phone screen from the office. The dye canister activated on contact with the pressure plate, exactly as tested. Bright orange powder, dense dispersal, immediate. It caught her hands first, then the front of the white blazer as the box lurched, then her face as she instinctively looked down at what was happening to her. She dropped the package, stumbled back a step, looked down at herself. Frank was already filming from his porch, had been since the Lexus pulled to the curb. Detective Reyes stepped out of his car 2 houses down. What Carol did next was perhaps the most revealing thing she'd done in 8 months. She didn't freeze, didn't sit down on the curb, didn't call anyone. She turned, orange-stained hands held slightly away from her body, and walked, still unhurried, still controlled, as if composure alone could undo what had just happened. Back to the Lexus. She touched the door handle, touched the steering wheel, touched the window when she tried to check her reflection, evidence multiplying with every surface she contacted. Reyes reached her driver's side window before she could pull away. The formal presentation happened 4 days later, in the same community room where Carol had told me she'd note my concern and move to the next agenda item. Reyes had requested use of the space from the HOA board, the 3 members who were not Carol, to present findings to residents before charges were formally filed. Sandra had helped organize the notification. 31 residents showed up. I stood at the back. Reyes laid it out in order, not dramatically, methodically, the same way I'd built the spreadsheet, the same way Frank had kept his handwritten log. He started with the timeline, 14 months of documented incidents, beginning with Frank's first recorded observation and running through the Monday deployment. 31 entries in Frank's log, 41 confirmed camera events in my records, 17 households ultimately identified, total losses exceeding $22,000. He showed the camera clips, 14 of them, sequenced chronologically, each one opening with the timestamp, each one showing the same silver Lexus, the same unhurried walk, the same manicured hand. By the 5th clip, the room had gone very quiet. By the 10th, nobody was looking at anything except the screen. He presented the email thread, Carol's reply recommending the package locker service, the affiliate partnership link, the carefully worded suggestion that residents refrain from speculation that might unfairly implicate innocent parties. He read that last line aloud once and let it sit. He presented Sandra's written account, Frank's handwritten log, the Wynn's statement, Patricia's documentation of the controlled substance loss, and the employer notification process it had triggered. 6 additional written accounts from neighbors who'd submitted statements after I'd quietly made contact over the preceding weeks. Then he presented the HOA complaint Carol had filed against my cameras, the one citing a privacy violation clause that didn't apply to owner-installed equipment on private property, and noted the date it was filed relative to the date of my first contact with law enforcement. The room understood the implication without him having to state it. He explained the charges, 11 counts of mail theft, 2 counts of theft of prescription medication, 1 count of witness intimidation, based on Carol's unsolicited approach to me at the corner of Delwood and Marsh, and the verbatim account I'd filed with Reyes within the hour. Federal jurisdiction applied to 7 of the mail theft counts due to USPS carrier involvement. Inspector Tran from the Postal Inspection Service had coordinated on those. The ceiling, Reyes said, was considerably higher than a standard residential theft case. Then he turned to me at the back of the room and said, "Mr. Calloway, anything you want to add?" I thought about it for a moment. 31 neighbors looking at me, the community room that smelled like old carpet, the folding table where Carol had smiled and moved to the next agenda item. She had opportunities to stop, I said. More than one. She knew people were paying attention. She filed a complaint specifically to disrupt the documentation. She approached me directly to suggest consequences for continuing. At every point where a reasonable person would have recognized the situation and changed course, she accelerated instead. I paused. The evidence didn't build a case against her. She built it herself. I just kept the records in order. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Frank, from his seat in the second row, said, "Took long enough." A few people laughed. The tension broke the way tension breaks when justice has finally arrived, and everyone in the room knew it was coming, but couldn't be sure until it did. Carol Simmons was arrested the following morning. Faced with UV-marked hands, 14 HD camera clips, Frank's 14-month log, Sandra's signed account, 6 additional neighbor statements, the email trail, the affiliate partnership documentation, and a witness intimidation charge she'd generated herself with a single unsolicited conversation at a street corner, she pleaded guilty within 60 days. No trial. No prolonged process, just a woman who had spent 4 years building a case against herself, finally running out of room to put it anywhere else. Justice doesn't always arrive like a verdict. Sometimes it arrives like a spreadsheet. Every row filled in, every column accounted for, the sum at the bottom exactly what it was always going to be. Carol Simmons received a federal sentence of 26 months, 3 years of supervised release, and restitution orders covering all documented losses across 17 households. The affiliate partnership with the package locker service was dissolved after the company was notified of the criminal proceedings. Her HOA treasurer position was vacated the week of her arrest. The board dissolved and restructured within 30 days. New bylaws required all officer positions to be filled by competitive election with a mandatory 2-term limit. Sandra ran for treasurer and won by a margin that suggested the neighborhood had been waiting a long time for the option. Frank was appointed interim treasurer in the gap period between dissolution and election. He accepted on the condition that the role involved minimal paperwork. The board agreed. He served 6 weeks, kept immaculate records, and stepped down the moment Sandra was sworn in. I asked him afterward how he'd found it. "Boring," he said. "The way it should be." I replaced the porch camera with a newer model in the weeks after the arrest, not out of necessity, but because the old one had earned retirement. The new setup is cleaner, wider, better integrated with the home network. I still check the feed most afternoons before I close my laptop for the day. Old habit, as I said. But what I see now is different. Delivery drivers who've started waving at the lens because they've figured out the camera is there. Frank crossing the street on Tuesday mornings with his coffee mug. The Wynn's kids drawing chalk on their driveway on weekends, which would have been a fence height level HOA violation under the previous administration, and is now simply a thing that happens on a Tuesday. My father came to stay for 2 weeks in the spring. I overnighted his updated medication before he arrived. It was on the porch steps when I got home from the office, exactly where it was supposed to be. I stood there for a moment with the box in my hands, aware of how ordinary that was, aware of how long ordinary had taken to get here. He asked me while he was visiting whether the neighborhood situation had resolved itself. I told him yes. He didn't ask for details. He's not that kind of man. He just nodded and went back to his coffee. Some things don't require explanation. They just require the work to be done correctly, and then they're done. The packages arrive on time now. The porch steps are undisturbed. The street has the particular quiet of a place where nothing dramatic is happening, which is exactly how a street is supposed to feel. It took 8 months of patience, 6 cameras, a retired postman's handwritten log, a detective who answered his emails, and a woman who couldn't stop herself from leaving evidence everywhere she went. But mostly, it took the simple decision to let Carol Simmons be exactly who she was, and to make sure every bit of it was on record when it mattered. What would change in your own life if you stopped trying to fight every wrong the moment it happened and started building the kind of case that makes the outcome inevitable?